Welcome to Behind the Beatles, Controversial or Counterculture. In this series, we'll dive deep into the most shocking and taboo moments of the Fab Four's career. From John Lennon's infamous declaration that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, to the shocking Butcher cover of their 1966 album, Yesterday and Today, and their candid revelations about taking drugs. But today, we're going to deep dive into the 1960s. I'm starting this new series here because the 1960s was one of the most transformational and controversial decades in modern history. And the Beatles, they only played their part. It was a time of incredible social upheaval and cultural revolution that marked a dramatic shift from early conservatism to a new era of liberation and change. We'll explore how this decade redefined norms, broke barriers, and forever altered the landscape of music, fashion, and social consciousness. While the Beatles often stand out as the iconic soundtrack of this era, they were just one part of a broader, dynamic generation that was shaping and being shaped by these tumultuous times. Let's start with the early 1960s. The early 1960s were marked by a continuation of the conservative values and norms that characterized the 1950s. This conservatism was reflected in various aspects of society, including fashion, social behavior, and cultural expectations. Here are some key elements that highlight the conservative nature of the early 1960s. Women typically wore modest, structured clothing, such as skirts and dresses, and emphasized traditional femininity. Men wore suits, ties, and hats, adhering to the formal and polished appearance. Women's hairstyles were often neat, controlled, such as a beehive or a bouffant, while men maintained short, well-groomed haircuts. The dominant cultural narrative emphasized traditional gender roles. Women were often expected to be homemakers and caregivers, while men were seen as the breadwinners. Marriage and family life were idealized, with a strong focus maintaining stable nuclear families. Divorce was stigmatized, and single parenthood was rare and socially frowned upon. There was a strong emphasis on maintaining moral propriety, which included conservative attitudes towards sexuality. Premarital sex and cohabitation were generally taboo. Social interactions were formal, with strict etiquette governing behavior in public and private life. Respectability and conformity were highly valued. Content was heavily censored to align with the conservative values. Shows like Leave It to Beaver and The Donna Reed Show depicted idolized family life and traditional gender roles. Early 1960s music, including the pop and rock and roll of the era, was relatively tamed compared to the latter part of the decade. Lyrics and performances were expected to adhere to societal norms. Schools enforced strict dress code and disciplinary standards. The curriculum often emphasized traditional subjects and moral education. Young people were generally expected to conform to societal norms, with a focus on preparing for traditional adult roles through education and early marriage. The pervasive fear of communism during the Cold War fostered a conservative, anti-subversion atmosphere. Loyalty to American values and institutes was emphasized, and dissent was often viewed with suspicion. Conversations about sex were typically private and conservative. Birth control was not widely discussed or accessible, contributing to traditional views on sexuality. Books, films, and other media were subject to strict censorship. The Motion Picture Product Code, Hays Code, dictated the content of the films, ensuring that they adhered to moral standards. The conclusion is, the early 1960s were characterized by a strong adherence to conservative values and norms. This period was marked by a commitment to traditional gender roles, modest fashion, moral propriety, and a focus on family stability. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that these conservative norms began to be challenged by various social movements and a growing counterculture, leading to the more liberal and open attitudes that would be defined by the latter part of the decade. The late 1960s. By the late 1960s, American culture had undergone a dramatic transformation from the conservative norms of the early 1960s. This period saw a radical shift in attitudes, behaviors, and societal values across multiple dimensions. Fashion became more diverse, and experimental. Women wore miniskirts, bell-bottoms, and colorful psychedelic patterns. Men adapted long hairstyle, beards, and a more casual attire. Clothing styles began to blur traditional gender distinctions, with both men and women embracing more androgynous looks. The feminist movement challenged gender roles, advocating for equal rights, pay, and opportunities. Women increasingly entered the workforce and pursued higher education. The traditional nuclear family model was questioned. There was a rise in divorce rates, cohabitation without marriage, and single-parent households became more common. Attitudes towards sex became more liberal. The availability of birth control and the influence of the counterculture promoted more open discussions and acceptance of premarital sex and alternative lifestyles. Recreational drug use, particularly of marijuana and LSD, became widespread among the youth, often associated with the counterculture and the quest for expand consciousness. Movies and music pushed boundaries, reflecting and shaping the Cultural Revolution. Films like Easy Rider and the music from artists like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin embroidered the spirit of the rebellion and change. Even TV shows like the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour introduced more controversial content, reflecting the changing social and political landscape. The hippie counterculture championed peace, love, and communal living. They often rejected materialism and traditional social norms, advocating for environmentalism, free love, and anti-war sentiments. The late 1960s saw an increase in political activism among youths. Anti-Vietnam protests, civil rights demonstrations, and students' movements highlighted the desire for social and political change. The civil rights movement achieved significant milestones, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws aimed to dismantle racial segregation and ensure equal rights. The Vietnam War faced growing opposition and large-scale protests. Also in the late 1960s, we saw a loosening of censorship in media. The MPAA film rating system, introduced in 1968, allowed for greater freedom and expression in films. The Stonewall riots of 1969 marked a pivotal moment in the gay rights movement, leading to a greater visibility and activism for LGBTO rights. By the late 1960s, American culture had significantly shifted from the conservative values of the early decades. This era was marked by greater personal freedom, more liberal attitudes towards sex and drug use, a challenge to traditional gender roles, and a surge in political activism and social movements. The counterculture played a central role in driving these changes, promoting ideas of peace, love, and equality that contrasted sharply with the earlier, more conservative ethos. The Beatles played a significant role in the counterculture movement of the 1960s, but they were both contributors to and products of the times. The shift in the counterculture was a multifaceted phenomenon driven by various social, political, and cultural factors. So the Beatles did not single-handedly start the counterculture movement, but they were pivotal in shaping and popularizing it. Their music, public image, and actions were both a response to and a catalyst for the cultural shifts of the 1960s. They were among the most visible and influential figures in a larger wave of a change sweeping across society. So this series will embark on the journey through the Beatles' most controversial moments. We'll explore not just the events themselves, but also their profound impact they had on the already shifting landscape of the 1960s counterculture. This series will delve into how the Beatles, with their unprecedented fame and influence, both mirrored and fueled the revolutionary spirit of the decade. Through their music, public statements, and personal lives, we'll see how they became icons of change, pushing boundaries, and challenging norms. Join us as we uncover the stories behind the headlines and understand the legacy of the band that was as much a product of its times as it was a catalyst for change. Stay tuned for an in-depth look at the Beatles' role in shaping a pivotal era in modern history.